Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's a great honor. I'll be talking about one of the oldest chapters in the history of analytic philosophy. I'll be talking about proper names and their semantics. I'll start by relating this to a little bit of a larger background. So I'll start by talking about natural language in general and the question of propositions. Now, many philosophers throughout the history of philosophy have thought that underlying the vast variety of manifestations of our life as minded, linguistically interacting creatures, there is a remarkable unity. The central idea here is that of a single kind of entity, unifying phenomena prima facie so different as a hope and an assertion, the proposition. However, there are also those who are very skeptical towards all the things that we want to do by means of propositions, all the jobs we want these entities to do for us, basically unifying our philosophy of language with our philosophy of mind and our folk psychology and so on. So here's David Lewis, who says that, I quote, "The conception we associate with the word proposition might be something of a jumble of conflicting desiderata." So what is it that we expect propositions to do for us? Here is at least part of the classical job description for the proposition. Propositions are traditionally supposed to be the bearers of truth conditions or truth values. They are supposed to be the bearers of necessity and possibility and of probability. They are also supposed to serve as the meanings of declarative sentences in context, the contents of the assertions we can make by means of these sentences, and the contents of the propositional attitudes. So that's indeed a whole bunch of things we want propositions to do for us. And there's not only skepticism about whether this is possible, but it might be fair to say that right now there's a growing consensus that no single kind of entity can play all the roles of the traditional job description. This consensus is in large part motivated from natural language semantics. So to see how that can be motivated in this way, let's think for a second about what a formal semantics for a natural language is supposed to do. Well, this is an empirical theory that assigns meanings to the expressions of our language and accounts not only for the possibility of successful communication by means of this language, but also its actual frequency and reliability. This connection with communication, successful communication, and its reliability and frequency provides us with pretty strong reasons for wanting a formal semantics to output classical propositions, things that have truth values, as the semantic values for sentences in context. After all, what we are communicating with are sentences that we utter to say things. It also, at the same time, provides us with strong reasons for wanting our semantics to be compositional, so that we can explain how we can understand the sentences that are being uttered, even though we might not have heard them before, and we can in particular explain how we can do this reliably and so often as we seem to be able to do it. So we should think a little bit about the principle of compositionality that most people who do formal semantics hold very dear. They think indeed that their formal semantic theories should obey this principle. And I will not go into any formal details in this talk. I'll keep the principle and most of what I'll be saying about semantics at a pretty informal level. So here's an informal formulation of the principle of compositionality. The meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of its parts and its mode of composition. this is what is called the functional version of compositionality, and that is all that we will need today. Okay, so you want to be able to explain how the meaning of a complex expression is sort of being composed from the meanings of its immediate parts and how they are put together. That would allow us to understand how we can communicate so well by means of language and why we do it so often. Okay. But there is a huge variety of observations about natural language that have led many to conclude that we in fact cannot have both. There is a choice to be made here. Semantics is either compositional or what I shall call propositional. That is, it obeys either the principle of compositionality or it is such that it outputs classical propositions as the semantic values for declarative sentences in context. What kind of observations are those? Well, to give you a quick flavor, there is a wide range of examples in which what is said by means of an utterance of a sentence in context appears to differ from the contribution that sentence makes to the semantic value of a more complex sentence embedding it. So if you have a simple sentence and it seems to be meaning one thing and then you embed it into something more complex, the contribution it actually makes to what you say with a more complex thing seems to be something different. And that of course does not work if we want to obey the functional compositionality principle. And here's a list of contexts where one can at least argue that this kind of phenomenon occurs. These are modal contexts, temporal contexts, belief contexts, quantification contexts, and quotation contexts. And the list could actually be prolonged. So this is quite a bit of stuff that we do with language every day. We talk about what could be the case, we talk about what was the case, we talk about what other people or we ourselves believe, and so on and so forth, or what holds for everything of a certain kind, and we quote other people. So this is pervasive, so this is serious stuff going on here. If this prevents us from our semantics either being compositional or propositional, then what we have here is a stark choice that needs to be made. In this talk, what will be playing a role are the modal contexts and a little bit also the belief contexts. Okay, so one conclusion to draw from this situation would be that the traditional job description for the proposition in fact confuses two roles that need to be kept apart. They are sort of mashed together in that description, but really we need to be clear on this and take them to be what they are, namely two very different roles. And one of them is what we could call the content or assertion role, and that is also the role where belief contents go. And the other is the compositional or semantic value role. So compositional or semantic values, we might think, will not be of the propositional kind. What is of the propositional kind, however, are the contents of assertions or of beliefs. So one could go that role, and I've put up some names there for you of people who push this line. But one could also try to defend the propositionality of semantics. And there are some people who try to do that. And amongst them are my husband, Peter Pagin, and me. And we have this project that we call Switcher Semantics. It's been going on for a little while. And the project is to investigate to what extent we can keep semantics propositional by means of employing a particular kind of formal semantic theory that we call switcher semantics. And I'll of course explain what that is. But first, I'll now go over to talking about proper names and why they are relevant in this kind of dialectic. And I'll first talk about a pretty classical debate going back all the way to Frege and Russell. And in the Fregean or Russellian tradition, proper names, such as, for instance, Aristotle, were held to have descriptive content. Now, there might be all sorts of descriptive content a speaker or a community of speakers might associate with a name, and which are best suited for playing this role is, of course, a matter of great debate. I'm not going to go into that. For what I'm going to today, what plays a role is whether names have descriptive content at all or not. Later we'll look a little bit into newer versions of description theories of names, according to which names have what can be called meta-linguistic content. We'll see about that later. Then Kripke famously argued that proper names cannot be synonymous with ordinary, non-rigid, definite descriptions. And the argument here, at least the, let's say, in this debate, most important argument, has exactly to do with this kind of embedding behavior that I was talking about earlier. So here are two sentences. The first one is what we could call a modal sentence with a name in it. So we have Aristotle might not have gone into pedagogy. Now, one of the things that many people associate with Aristotle is that he was the teacher of Alexander. And we'll just use that as our example descriptive content here. Whether that's particularly suitable or not doesn't play much of a role for what I'm going to do. But let's just assume that we think that the descriptive content associated with the name Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander. Now, if we have a modal sentence like 1a here, and we exchange Aristotle in this sentence for what we just said would be something expressing its descriptive content, namely the teacher of Alexander, something interesting happens. What we get is a sentence, the teacher of Alexander might not have gone into pedagogy, which at least has a reading on which it is intuitively false. Because it would seem to imply that the teacher of Alexander is not a teacher. Okay, and this is not true of 1a. Aristotle might not have gone into pedagogy strikes most of us as outrightly true and not having any false reading. And that strongly suggests that Aristotle and the teacher of Alexander are not such that they can be substituted salva veritate in this context, and therefore they are not synonymous. Okay, so that is the famous modal argument. The question then is, how do we account for these modal data? And I think it's fair to say that pretty much everybody in the debate accepts these as data. These are extremely stable intuitions that I don't know of anybody actually disputing them. So this is something where you really would like your semantic theory to be able to capture it. And Kripke suggested accounting for the modal data by means of rigidity. So the idea here is that certain expressions are what is called rigid designators. Rigid designators are such that they refer to the same individual no matter what world you consider. So if you're doing possible worlds semantics, the possible worlds intension of a rigid designator is a constant function from worlds to one and the same individual, at least where that individual exists. In other words, you might say that the name does not refer. Okay. In that case, however, the propositions that sentences like Aristotle might not have gone into pedagogy express, we could call them rigid propositions, are such that they don't contain any information about Aristotle. So you might quite as well say simply that the meaning of the name isn't really anything else but just its referent, and that is what one of the most influential views ever since Kripke on the semantics of names actually holds. That's millionism. The view that the meaning of a name is nothing but its referent. There's nothing more to it than the referent, the object it's actually referring to. And millionism, of course, predicts that names are rigid designators. However, if we use these rigid propositions to give the meanings of our sentences containing proper names, what we get back is a host of well-known, what is called Frege puzzles. Look at 2a and 2b. These, if we have rigid propositions and Hesperus and Phosphorus, as we all know, co-refer, will express the very same rigid proposition. That might strike you as not so great, because it's entirely possible that it's true of someone, say Gottlob, that B is true while A is false. Someone who doesn't know of this identity might not be such that they believe that Hesperus is Phosphorus, even though they of course believe that Hesperus is Hesperus. So what we get here now is another kind of embedding behavior, now embedding behavior in an attitude context, a belief context, where something that, according to our now contemplated semantic theory at least, that has the same meaning, namely Hesperus is Phosphorus and Hesperus is Hesperus, embeds in such a way that it doesn't seem to be synonymous, because one of these sentences might actually be false, while it would be very difficult at least to see how B could be false. At least as long as Gottlob has any beliefs about Hesperus. All right. Another thing that happens is that these two sentences also express the same rigid proposition. Hesperus might not have been Phosphorus. Hesperus might not have been Hesperus. Now, this of course looks like Aristotle might not have been the teacher of Alexander, and it's perfectly right that there is an interpretation of these sentences where we think that this is the right prediction, and that is the so-called de re modal interpretation that also drove the intuition about the Aristotle sentences earlier. So when we are thinking in terms of de re modality, we want to think what might have been true of some object that actually has a certain property, but we want to know whether this very object could not have had that property, could have been different from what it actually is. And that's very well captured if you're thinking about this in terms of rigidity. However, as we just saw, as there is this sense in which Gottlob might not believe that Hesperus is Phosphorus, there also is a sense, it seems to many of us, in which Hesperus might not have been Phosphorus could be true, at least at a time where someone does not know of this identity. What we are thinking about then, as Kripke of course pointed out himself, is some kind of epistemic or dedicto modality. So if we think that there are dedicto modal operators, and we might very well think that, think of a situation where we actually do not know whether certain identities are true. And here's, I think, an example. You might all know about Elena Ferrante, who wrote the Neapolitan novels, which have been very, very successful and read all over the world. But nobody, for a long time at least, had any idea who Elena Ferrante was. So she wanted to keep her identity secret. She didn't want the kind of attention that comes with being a well-known author and so on. So nobody really knew who Elena Ferrante is. Then came some Italian journalist who claims to have found out who she actually is, and according to him, it's a translator whose name is Anita Raja. So if we imagine that we are not totally convinced by these findings, we might say now that, yeah, Anita Raja, for all I know, might well be Elena Ferrante. At the same time, if the evidence isn't particularly strong, or we still have like significant doubt, we might as well also say, no, Anita Raja might not be Elena Ferrante. So both of these sentences might be true in the very same epistemic situation. So in that case, if we think that, we are construing the might in these sentences as a dedicto or epistemic model. And that too is puzzlesome if we are thinking of names as rigid designators. For, I mean, either this is true or it isn't, that Anita Raja is Elena Ferrante. There is just no other possibility. So what we seem to be getting into here is a sort of dilemma. We can either think of names as having some descriptive contents, in which case we might be able to capture what they are doing in belief contexts or in epistemic modal contexts. But then they will also vary their referent when we consider de re modal sentences, and that's not so great. So if on the other hand we go for a view that implies the rigidity of names, we get no such modal variability at all. So it seems like we are in this dilemma where we can either have too much variability or no variability at all. And this is very nicely summarized by a very recent paper by my colleague Anders Scobie, who says, the more general point is that in order to effectively solve the problems that arise with names in modal environments, and modal environments here are all these environments, belief contexts, the array modal contexts, the dicto modal contexts. To effectively solve the problems that arise with names in modal environments, we need a certain level of variability in some modal environments to capture the right truth conditions, but no variability in other modal environments. The million analysis provides no variability at all. With the descriptivist analysis, we get variability in all modal contexts, but this leads to incorrect predictions with respect to metaphysical modals. Let's call this the problem of modal variability. And basically it is, as I was saying, names need to be modally variable in certain contexts, but not in others. Now, Scobie suggests that making progress in this situation actually requires going beyond the kind of data I've been giving you so far. So according to this diagnosis, what we are having is a sort of deadlock between views that fall on the descriptivist side and views that fall on the anti-descriptivist side. And each side here gets impaled on one horn of the dilemma I was just talking about. So you have either too much variability or no variability at all. So one might think, as Scobie says, I quote, given the interdependent nature of these problems, that alternative data points should be considered in order to settle the debate. I'm not quite on board with framing the narrative in this way. I would like to, at this point, just note that there are accounts around of the semantics of names that precisely aim at providing this kind of modal variability, the right kind of modal variability. And I'll just drop some names here. There's David Chalmers and two-dimensional semantics. There's Manuel García Carpintero with his Mill-Frege theory. And there is, for instance, Ima Meyer in the discourse representation theory tradition. And then there also is switcher semantics. So what I'm going to show you next is not how everybody else here that I just named is going to do this, but I'm showing you our way of doing it, which is a way where you build the required variability right into your formal semantic theory. So that brings us to switcher semantics. Switcher semantics is a generalization of more standard semantics that works with several semantic evaluation functions. So normally you have one evaluation function, and here we simply say, well, we could have more of those. One of those functions will be the designated function, and we'll see what that exactly means later. But the gist of it is that if you think that you can switch around between different such functions, you want to know how to start when you sort of feed a sentence into your formal semantic theory. So what you start with is your designated function. Then the basic idea is that of an evaluation switcher, which we think of as a syntactic operator that switches the semantic evaluation function applied to expressions within its scope from the function that applies to the operator itself to a different evaluation function. So you start your sentence, you start with your designated function, you come to this operator, the operator tells you to switch the function and do something else with the stuff that is within its scope. This way, switcher semantics formally implements a distinction that was quite a while ago introduced by Michael Dummett, the distinction between asatoric contents and ingredient senses. Because as you can already see, there will be one thing here that will be associated with the sentence as a whole, its asatoric content. But if you can switch how you evaluate an expression within the scope of an operator in that sentence, evaluate that in a different way from what you otherwise would, that expression will have an ingredient sense in that sentence, which will be different from what it would express if you were evaluating it just by itself by means of your designated function. There is a distinction very similar to the asatoric content ingredient sense distinction also in David Lewis. That's the distinction between what is said and the semantic value of a sentence, of an expression. Okay. So, and in fact, when we started thinking about switcher semantics, the first thing we were thinking about were in fact proper names and the array modal operators. So the idea was to construe the de-array modal operators as precisely switchers. They switch what we call the term evaluation function, applying to names within their scope in such a way that names will be evaluated at the actual world. So this is the very basic idea here. You have the operator and it switches what happens within its scope for names in such a way that only the actual world referent will be interesting. So that way we can explain the substitution behavior of names in the array modal contexts. But at the same time we can allow the names to have descriptive contents. Contents that then remain available to provide them with the required variability in other contexts. So really the basic idea is that in the contexts where we need them to be what we could call modally stable, we just switch off the variability. We switch the evaluation to evaluation at the actual world. But we don't do that in general. So names can have these descriptive contents that then can be playing a role when they are embedded within the scope of other modal operators, namely those that we saw require variability. And here comes the only little bit that today will be a little formal. I will show you a little bit how this actually works. I'll do this in a truth conditional format because that is most illustrative. So we can say that standardly, if you just work with one evaluation function, an atomic sentence such as p t1 to tn, where you have a predicate p and you have a number of terms, such a sentence is evaluated as true in a possible world W, just in case the n tuple of the reference of t1 to tn in that possible world belongs to the extension of the predicate in that world. So here we have I, that is an interpretation function assigning references to terms and extensions to predicates in possible worlds. So we normally get this kind of evaluation function, which we call P here for possibilist evaluation. So a sentence P t1 to tn will be true at a world W if and only if what the interpretation function assigns as reference to t1 to tn at that world belongs to the extension of the predicate in that world. To do switchers for the array modal sentences, the idea then is that we add a second evaluation function to our semantics. This we call actualist evaluation, and in actualist evaluation we consider, instead of the reference of our terms in the possible world in question, the reference in the actual world, A. So according to actualist evaluation, our little sentence will be true at a possible world if what our interpretation function assigns to the terms in the actual world belongs to the extension of the predicate at the possible world we are considering. Now this is defined only for simple singular terms that get their reference directly from I, and we want to allow maybe complex singular terms too, or at least we want to be able to remain neutral on that. So we might want to think of applied functional expressions such as the father of Annette as a singular term, and we might also want to think of definite descriptions such as the teacher of Aristotle as complex singular terms. And then those we would not want to evaluate according to in this way at the actual world. So what we do is we replace the very simple actualist evaluation by this one, A plus, where instead of I we have a term evaluation function V for our terms, and that will be defined differentially for simple singular terms and complex singular terms. So for the simple singular term, it's just the same as we had before. What the term evaluation function associates with that is just the referent at the actual world. But for these other kinds of possible possible singular terms, namely the complex one, we make the term evaluation function evaluate the predicative parts of such expressions at the possible world in question that we are considering. So that gives you the contrast between Aristotle and the teacher of Alexander, if you think the teacher of Alexander is a singular term. So now we have our two evaluation functions. What we also want then is the idea of a switcher. So the idea is to use actualist evaluation only for Dirac modal sentences, or more precisely, only for what is within the scope of a Dirac modal operator. While the standard evaluation is used for atomic sentences. So in this case here of our little switcher semantics with two evaluation functions, standard P is the designated function, that's what you start out with, and we use A plus for the semantic contribution of an atomic sentence to a modal sentence, embedding it. And we effect this by giving the Dirac modal operator a truth definition clause that runs something like this. It is necessary that phi is true at a possible world if and only if it is A plus true at any world W prime that is accessible from W, where A plus true just means true according to the completed actualist evaluation A plus. And you can notice here that the whole sentence, it is necessary that phi gets its truth value assigned at a possible world. So the incoming or the designated function here is possibilist P. So the resulting truth value of this whole thing will be such that it's true or false at a possible world. Okay, and in this way we are making necessary into a switcher. It is necessary that becomes a switcher here. So what's within its scope will be evaluated by means of a different semantic evaluation function from what we started out with. Okay. And this, we think, chimes very well with the Dirac character of Dirac modality. As I was saying earlier, when asking whether an object O that is F might have been otherwise, what we want to know is precisely whether that very object is such that it might not have been F. We don't want to know whether some other object might not have been F. We want to know this of this very object. And that is what we get if we evaluate Dirac modal sentences according to this suggested semantics. As we can also see, using the semantic predicts the desired results for pairs of sentences like those we had earlier from the modal argument. Aristotle might not have gone into pedagogy. That will pick out Aristotle and say of him that he might not have gone into pedagogy, which is, of course, strikes us as true. But if we have the teacher of Alexander, then we also get this reading where this can be false. And that we get no matter whether we analyze the teacher of Alexander as a singular term or in a Russellian way or something, for instance. Okay, so this is as desired. Now, as I was saying, the overarching project here, part of the motivation for doing switches semantics, not just for the array modal sentences, but also for other sentences, of course, other operators and so on, is to investigate to what extent we can keep semantics propositional. So how does that go? In general, a switcher semantics uses a finite set S of semantic evaluation functions. So this is now generalizing beyond what I've shown you. You can simply think of that we will need further switched functions for further operators, and that these functions might not be A+, they might be something else, and some such things have actually been suggested. For quotation, for example, Peter Pagin and Dag Westerståhl have worked out a switcher semantics for that, and Peter has a very nice paper about belief sentences where he does switcher semantics for belief sentences. And I mean, it's very versatile. You can do tons of things with this quite simple idea of a semantic evaluation switcher. However, in order to be interesting in certain ways, we think that the evaluation functions that we can use need to be kept finite. So a switcher semantics uses a finite such set. One of these, as I already said, is the designated function. Interpretation always starts with it. No matter what you feed into your semantics, the first thing you get is the designated function. That applies to the outermost, let's say, operator. And then the operator might or might not switch the interpretation function. That depends on whether the operator actually is a switcher. Not all of them need to be switchers. Some of them can be what we call keepers. They put out the same interpretation function that applied to themselves. Switching here in such a system is deterministic because the way we think of it, it's entirely syntax driven. So to have a switch, you need an operator that does the switching. And this means that there is a switching function from operators and evaluation functions in S to further evaluation functions. And this will tell you sort of in advance what will happen at any occasion for switching. Also, in order to be a switcher semantics worth its name, there needs to be at least one switcher, that is, at least one operator where the function that is applied to things in its scope is different from the function that is applied to the operator itself. Okay. Now, when it comes to this question of whether the semantics is propositional, that is, whether it outputs classical propositions for declarative sentences, what we need to think about is the designated function. And as long as the designated function is a function from worlds to truth values, a switcher semantics for a language L will be propositional. For each disambiguated sentence of L, it will output exactly one classical propositions. All sorts of things might happen in the evaluation further down, but as long as you start, for instance, with what we called P, as we do in our semantics, what you have at the very start is the sentence is true, add a possible world, if and only if. And then you spell that out and you go down your tree and you do your switches if you need to. But what you will end up with will be a proposition. Of course, you could think of having a switcher semantics that starts with a different designated evaluation function. But as long as the designated one is such a function from worlds to truth values, the semantics can be kept propositional. So that is one thing that we find very interesting and neat about switcher semantics. Now, I also said earlier that there is a choice to be made. Semantics is either compositional or propositional. Now, if switcher semantics gives us the possibility of keeping our semantics propositional, and we want that, or at least we want to find out how far we can go down this road. What does that mean for compositionality? Well, here's the principle of compositionality again. The meaning of a complex expression is the function of the meanings of its parts and its mode of composition. The suggested switcher semantics, already just what I showed you today, is not compositional in this standard sense. So in a way, we agree. There is a choice to be made here. It's propositionality or compositionality. But that only holds as long as we are considering standard compositionality. If we want to keep the spirit of compositionality, and as anyone doing formal semantics for natural language, of course we have a strong drive to do that. Standard compositionality must be replaced by some more general idea, where an expression is allowed to have different meanings in different syntactic contexts. So here's an informal formulation of the principle of general compositionality. It says that the meaning of a complex expression E is a function of the meanings that its parts have in the contexts in which they occur in E and its mode of composition. This has been worked out formally and has been shown to be non-trivial. You can look that up. And what is relevant for us in this context today is that when it comes to explaining successful communication and its frequency and how easy it is for us to understand sentences we have never heard before and how reliable a communication by means of language is, and so on and so forth, general compositionality is just as good at explaining that as standard compositionality. So general compositionality really does everything for you that compositionality was ever supposed to do. Because of that, we require a switcher semantics to be general compositional. You can do switching where this principle is not obeyed, but we think that this is what it should be, and since we sort of own the brand here, a switcher semantics is a switcher semantics only if it is general compositional. And the switcher semantics I showed you today is general compositional. So we can sum this up by saying that switcher semantics allows us to make use of the esoteric content ingredient sense distinction while keeping our semantics propositional. And while we do need to give up standard compositionality for general compositionality, that does not seem much of a price to pay. Okay, and that brings me to the last part of my talk, where I'll now look at more recent developments, and I'll get back to what we saw Scobie suggesting earlier, namely that we need additional data to break the deadlock between descriptivism and anti-descriptivism when it comes to proper names. Now, as I said, I'm not quite buying into that narrative, but even if we don't agree with this diagnosis of the classical debate, relevant additional data must, of course, always be taken into account. So what I shall do in the remainder of this talk is I shall look at predicative and bound uses. These have been much discussed in recent literature. There is more data that has been discussed in recent literature, but I had to make a choice because of time. These kinds of data in particular have been used to support positions such as predicativism and variabilism. And in an earlier version of this talk, the director's cut, so to speak, I actually talk about predicativism, but then I realized that I do not have time to actually discuss that. So I'll only discuss these uses in relation to the position called variabilism. So what are predicative uses of names? Here are some examples. These are not particularly unusual. We say things like this all the time. We might say 2 authors came to the meeting. We might complain about Jespers and say that most Jespers do not attend meetings. And we might talk about someone, Pelle, who came to visit us and brought cinnamon buns, but now has gone home again. And since there are some other Pelles around too, we might say something like, the Pelle who brought the cinnamon buns went home again. Now, one thing I should say at this point is that what predicative uses of names, of course, surf on is that there's this idea that there might be many people called Åsa or many people called Pelle around. So names are such that they do not usually just have one bearer in the whole wide world. That is something I will not talk about in this talk, mostly because I absolutely totally have no time, but also because I don't think I have anything original to say about it. Okay. In these predicative uses, the names look like they are constituents of determiner phrases, 2 authors, most Jespers, the Pelle who, and so on. And they seem to express properties. If someone utters 5, they are quite naturally taken to be saying that 2 people called Åsa came to the meeting. If you don't know anything else about the context in which this sentence is uttered, or maybe if it is uttered just out of the blue, this is the interpretation that most naturally comes to mind. So here we express apparently some properties being called properties, let's say, with names. Let's call this kind of predicative use of names calling uses, precisely because the properties that are expressed appear to be calling properties or being called properties. We can compare these to uses where the names do not appear to be parts of determiner phrases. And in the literature, most people refer to these uses, the uses we have been discussing in the whole first part of the talk, as referential uses. And we can leave that as sort of a name for these uses without making any prior commitment to how the names work here. And here, as you can see, at least in English, in these uses, the names do not allow to be combined with determiners. We don't say the author came to the meeting, even though sometimes we actually do when we want to make a contrast with someone called something else. But usually what we do is author came to the meeting or Jesper did not, and we say things like Pelle went home again. Okay. According to traditional forms of both descriptivism and anti-descriptivism, names are basically ambiguous between these referential and these predicative uses. However, one might think that that is not such a great idea, at least if one thinks that the ambiguity displayed between these kinds of uses is such that there's basically no semantic connection between a referential use and a predicative use of a name. It doesn't quite seem like two authors and author are related as the two meanings of bank, for instance. Namely, not at all. Okay, and something that might push us in this direction where we think, okay, that maybe is not such a great idea, at least if there's no connection between the two kinds of meanings, are what has come to be called Hornsby inferences. And here are two examples. We can say author is a philosopher, so at least one author is a philosopher. Or we can say no Jesper came to the meeting and conclude so Jesper did not come to the meeting. And such inferences seem to be valid in some sense. And of course, when we're dealing with the validity of inferences, a semantic link would be nice, it might seem. At least we can say that a semantic link between predicative and referential uses would help explain why these inferences at least seem to be valid in some sense. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at how the view called variabilism deals with these data. And variabilism is the view that names are assignment-dependent singular terms. There are different versions of variabilism around. I'll concentrate on Scobie's. So on this view, the analysis of names is very analogous to that of pronouns. So they really just basically work like he or she, which means that the semantic value of a name n is a partial function from assignments to individuals. This function is partial because of a presuppositional constraint. The function is defined only if the relevant individual has the property of being called n. So this is very parallel to standard analysis of pronouns, where, for instance, the pronoun she carries a presuppositional constraint of the reference being female. Okay. Before we look at all the data we just talked about, however, I want to look at the modal variability problem that started us into all of this. So I want to look at how variabilism deals with that. And this is one of the big strengths of this position, because variabilism does make names rigid, so it has no problem with names in the context of the array modal operators, but at the same time it allows for shifting the assignment. So we do have two dimensions of variability according to this position. We can shift worlds for the array modal operators, which will not do anything to the names because they are rigid designators. But we can also shift assignments, and that will do something to the names because they are relative to assignments, their reference. So that can then be used to account for names' behavior within other modal contexts or attitude contexts. So this is very nice. However, what we should note is that variability comes at the price of propositionality. According to such a semantics, the semantic values of declarative sentences in contexts are sets of world assignment pairs, not classical propositions. And there we might just ask, how does that work when it comes to using these as, for instance, belief contents or the contents of assertions? And I'll quote from a recent paper, Brian Ball and Brian Rayburn, "What sense does it make to say that what is said or what is believed is true or false depending on an assignment function? What could a theorist be representing by modeling what is said in this way?" Now, I'm not saying we can't have answers to these questions. It just seems to me that it might be a price. We need further answers if we go this way when we want to account for variability. It might just be that a semantics that always delivers you with a proposition is preferable. Okay, now what happens when we look at Hornsby inferences if we are a variabilist? Here's our inference: author is a philosopher, so at least one author is a philosopher. Scobie tells us that such inferences are indexically valid. That is, the truth of the premise in some context C intuitively necessitates the truth of the conclusion in C. And that seems sort of right. And variabilism can explain this by means of the semantic presupposition that the referent of author is called author. This presupposition is triggered by use of author, so that if 11 is true in some context, it immediately follows that at least one individual called author is a philosopher is also true in that context. So that's neat, but such a presupposition is triggered no matter whether it is part of the semantics or not. In fact, whatever we say, presuppositions to the effect that what we are talking about is called what we are calling it are triggered. Which means that any semantics for names can use this explanation for the Hornsby inferences. It seems like the right explanation to me, but it doesn't really matter whether it's in the semantics or not, because these presuppositions are triggered no matter what. And I think that means that Hornsby inferences do not seem to be data that hold any lessons specific to names. Now, Scobie also uses the being called presupposition to connect the referential and calling uses. According to him, these do amount to a form of ambiguity, but one requiring a semantic link, as we said, no world knowledge appears to be necessary for understanding calling uses. Semantic competence with a name appears enough. Being called presuppositions provide this link. Yes, that is neat, but again, the pragmatic version of this explanation is available to be combined with any semantics for names whatsoever, and it might well explain why calling uses are the most natural ones that come to mind if we just see a predicative use of a name without being provided any context or without knowing pretty much anything about the referent of the name. But given this, that a pragmatic version of this explanation is available for any semantics for proper names, it appears at least rather questionable whether predicative uses of names in fact hold any lessons specific to the semantics of names. Now, what about the bound uses? Well, look at the second one. Is there really a fully general reading of that discourse? Even Cumming, who pushes this most, who came up with the examples, as far as I know, said that example says our intuitions go back and forth here. So maybe that is not such a very strong data point. You might, of course, think that, oh, this works because the speaker has a particular earnest in mind, and we can go on talking about that, and that is quite right. But again, one might think that this is an instance of a much more general pattern of language use. And here's something that is actually a real-world example. A discourse I almost like to call good ideas raisins. There were 3 raisins in the new theory. That's not a paper by David Lewis, but it's from the book about Tversky and Kahneman. Okay, so that leaves us with Bambi sentences. Here one could say, at least, I mean, variabilism would seem to be at its best here. However, it really would seem to predict that bound uses should be super common, just like they are for pronouns. But in fact, they are exceedingly rare. This sentence is one of the very few examples that are out there in the literature. Now, there might be an explanation in terms of a givenness hierarchy. We might think that pronouns are always strongly preferable to names and descriptions, at least when it doesn't lead to ambiguity. But even if that is true, it doesn't help with 13, since there is, it would be much nicer with a pronoun instead of Bambi. Also, I mean, if we are a variabilist and think that names basically work just like pronouns, why exactly would pronouns to be preferred in the first place? We would need at least an explanation for that. Okay, that brings me to the end. I have argued for a rather conservative take on the relevant data. Predicative uses do not seem to hold any special lessons for the semantics of names, and bound uses remain too elusive to be of at least great weight. The decisive problem, therefore, it seems to me, is still that of modal variability. And here, if we compare the two positions that we have looked at, that provide enough but not too much variability, namely variabilism and switcher semantics, the comparison is such that, yeah, well, they both give us the right kinds of variability, or at least promise to do so. But for variabilism, this comes at the price of propositionality. And I, for one, probably would be at least hesitant to pay that price. Thank you.